Hi, this is a message in response to Desilicious video on colorism and Black Lives Matter. Um, I'm going to go over some falsehoods of BLM, and then I'm going to talk a little about my background in colorism. Okay. If anything I want for viewers to take away from this video, it is that you need to know your scope. And scope is where you start. Any assertion, any study, any essay, whatever. Scope is how true or how broadly applied your viewpoint or assertion is to the system. Are you only talking about, say, for example, your neighborhood, or are you talking about your city? You talking about your state? Okay, whatever. It goes on and on. Black Lives Matter horribly gets us wrong. Okay, and I'm going to talk about that because it is uprooting not only our nation, but it's spread like wildfire all over the world. Black Lives Matter, the movement, is full of lies, ulterior motives, obfuscations, and I'm going to first start with probably the holy grail data here for police brutality, and that is Washington Post's database. So go search on GitHub. They posted their database there, and it is their collection from basically it's all the police involved homicides from 2014 to 2020, so 6 years, and I'm gonna just talk about some of the results. Okay, you're gonna see for yourself that it is this thing is just blown out of proportion for one. Okay, let's go over this. Just some numbers real quick. All right. There are about 330 million people in America. There are also about 300 million police stops per year. And there are 6,000, or sorry, well, 6,000 over 6 years. So 1,000 people killed by police per year. All right. The homicide rate has sort of gone up in the 80s and 90s, all the way up to 12 people killed per 10,000, I think, or 100,000. So 12.1, that's the metric per 100,000. And it declined in the 2000s and 2010s down to around high fives. And then last year, 2000, ever since the BLM rise and COVID, it jumped back up to 6. So in terms of the success of policing, you can see that it is mega successful over the decades. It reduced homicides by about almost 2/3 in about 15 years. So I want you to keep that in mind. All right. If now America was never as good as most of Europe. Most of Europe has had enjoyed like homicides rates. Like Sweden had something like one to two, between 1 to 2, since 1950 or something like that. So America was always trailing them. But we, of course, have different problems. We have a much less homogenous society. We have different neighbors. We have Mexico as a neighbor and Canada as a neighbor. Of course, Europe has their own neighbors, but they're all different, right? The point is, though, is that something was obviously working, right? We reduced the homicide rate. And what is the number of homicides? Do you know? Okay. So we said there's 1,000 people are killed by police every year. And if you look at the CDC's data, more than 8,000 blacks, just blacks, we're just talking blacks, more than 8,000 blacks are killed by other blacks. So their homicide rate is much larger than the police, of course. But let's get into police, because I'm with you. No one likes corrupt public officials, whether they be politicians or cops, or whatever. So it is very important when there is a corrupt official that we rally against them. But it's also really important not to be a mob, not to just have emotional outrage and don't look at the data, which is very true in many other viral cases. So 1,000 killed by police every year. Most of the suspects, by and large, were attacking the officer. And most of the attackers had a deadly weapon. If you look, there's 3,465 suspects had a gun. So that's over half. 889 had knives. If you don't believe knives are deadly, look up Eskrima. So that already accounts for about 3/4 of the suspects. So 3/4 suspects have either guns or knives, and there's more. 189 had vehicles, so they were trying to run somebody over. There's all sorts of stuff. There's pipes, there's pickaxes, there's a nail gun, there's a microphone, there's metal pipes. 49 had machetes, 12 had hatchets, 18 had hammers, 15 had guns and a vehicle, 19 had guns and a knife, 11 had guns and a car. There's people with chainsaws, there's 9 with crossbows. I mean, it is all over the place. So, by and large, these suspects are dangerous, nonetheless. 394 were not unarmed. 200 of them had a toy weapon, but you'd have to look at all the individual cases. For example, some of these toy weapons look very realistic. There was that one reality star, what was her name, in LA, where she had mental illness, and they did everything correct. They sent in the social worker first, and then she pulled out a BB gun, and that BB gun looked very realistic. And of course, you're in the moment. You can't go up to her and say, "Hey, let me look at that. Let me see if it's an actual gun." No, she's pointing at you from like 20 feet away, and she's menacing. And they killed her. And that's why we have that saying, death by cop. So only 394 were not unarmed. And this is probably the area which you might want to concentrate on the most, of whether they're justified or not, because someone unarmed is probably less lethal than having a gun or knife, etc. But that doesn't mean an unarmed person is not dangerous. There are many examples of people that are unarmed that knock people out, and that person that gets knocked out, their head hits the pavement, and then they have a hemorrhage, they have brain hemorrhage or whatever. Okay, some people die, some people get gravely mortally injured. All right, so the concentration was on the unarmed, and for the most part, a lot of them were still attacking. And again, you can verify this. Go download a database, Google it. It's on GitHub, Washington Post. Police involved homicides database. I'm sure it'll pop up right away. Put it into your Excel, or in my case, I use Linux to analyze it. Whatever data analysis you want, data analysis tool. Okay, it's there. When I'm going through more data, so guess how many black males died that were not unarmed? 59. 59 black unarmed males were killed from 2014 to 2020. That means less than 10 per year. 10 out of 330 million people. 10 out of 300 million police stops per year. Do the math. Okay? And again, just because they're unarmed doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. Right? If you knock out a cop, not only will they have severe, possible brain damage, but now the cops' weapons are available. And I can show you footage of such case where a pro boxer nearly knocked out a cop. So that is not nearly what BLM claims. This is not an epidemic. This is not huge systemic racist killings. Less than 10 per year in the whole big country of the United States. You also don't see any disparities in black-controlled cities. And what I mean by black-controlled, that means that the city is a majority black city council, a majority black law enforcement group, and typically a black mayor. You don't see any difference. If you filter results for Baltimore, for Memphis, for Detroit, for Atlanta, for Jackson, and then you compare it to, say, places that have, more like liberal policies, more anti-racist policies, like San Francisco, New York, Portland. Okay, you actually see higher percentages in the former. All right. So, one explanation is, of course, well, there's more black people there, so obviously there would be more black homicides. True. But for example, in Jackson, 100% of the police-involved homicides were black. 100%. And so if you compare the amount of uh, police-involved homicides with the total population, the total black population, right? So police who kill, or blacks are killed by police versus total blacks in the city, you still consistently see more. So riddle me this: how is it that a black controlled city still has racial disparities against black suspects? Don't tell me that they're white supremacists, because that would be ridiculous. To think that a black demographic can't vote for themselves, can't produce police from their own neighborhoods to protect their own neighborhoods, and then for some far leftists to call them white, oh my god, that's just ridiculous gaslighting. Okay, so I wanted to wrap up Washington Post database there. Please take a look. It's very important because that is raw data, and that pretty much destroys most of their narrative already. But if you need more proof, look at Roland G. Fryer's study. Roland G. Fryer, professor of economics at Harvard, the highest paid actually. He come from a rather poor black neighborhood in, I think, Tampa, Florida. Rose ranks, got a scholarship, and then basically became the youngest professor at Harvard that ever got tenure. He's a star. Okay, this guy's brilliant. He did his study where he found that there was actually less likelihood of a black suspect getting shot by police for the same actions as a white suspect. And that is because when people say black suspects are 2.5 times more likely to be shot by police than whites, they are saying a white lie. They didn't say whether the suspect was attacking, etc., if they were acting belligerent, if they had already attacked someone, if they were in a crime. All these factors matter. And the number one thing that matters the most in how police treat you is whether you're violent or not. Because in a civilized society, we abhor violence. The same thing goes for incarceration. I won't go too far into detail, but look into the federal mandatory minimums. Look at the raw data. There's a study published by the University of Michigan that I think covered some 30,000 cases, 30,000 mandatory minimum cases. Our federal bureau also releases data. Okay, mandatory minimums. Who is getting hit by them hardest? And who gets relief from them? If we were a white supremacist state, you would imagine that whites get the most privilege from mandatory minimums, right? Not true. Guess who? Hispanics. Hispanics actually get the most mandatory minimum relief, and by a large margin. And if you take into all the accounts of whether the suspect was violent or not, if they're a repeated felon, if you don't know about categories 1 through 6, basically it means the higher category you go, that means you've done worse crimes, more frequent crimes, and more violent crimes. You take all that into consideration, the racial disparity nationwide drops to about 7%, according to the study by Sonia Starr and University of Michigan. Okay. So is there some? Yes, but not a lot. Okay, 7%. It's not the whatever they claim 20 times longer sentences because they're simply black. No, they're longer because they're violent felons, for the most part. And then if you look at the national data, the mandatory minimum disparities vary state to state. So California has like almost no disparity. Louisiana, I think, had the highest. And many other states don't have much disparity at all. All lies. All right, so we've already debunked police brutality. And in another video, I can do individual case like Trayvon Martin, Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. Funny thing about Ahmaud Arbery, in the same month, in the same county, 2 white officers were arresting a white man that was harassing 2 black guys. And the white suspect fired upon, they had a big gunfight, and one of the white officers died. Well, both of the officers were white. So it's like, how you want to play it, right? Like, same county, not even, I don't know, not even like 100 miles away, and you have a white officer dying for a black civilian. So it's not, the narrative is not unilateral, but the media obviously wants you to believe that. Now I'm going to get into the more personal stuff on colorism, okay? Because that was sort of the bigger idea here. I am familiar with colorism, okay? I'm of East Asian descent. We have that there too. Particularly for women, it's not so much, colorism is not really as big a deal for males. Colorism is not white supremacists. It is simply ancient supremacists, I guess you say, class supremacists. I mean, they had colorism in China and Japan and Korea long before white colonials arrived. It is simply from misinterpretations or interpretations of melanin and sun. That's it. That is literally it. When you're out working in the fields, who are the labor class, you're gonna have darker skin, no matter who you are or where you are. All right, that's it. It may be parallel thinking, but it's not an exclusive idea. Is it wrong? Um, Today, obviously, it's pretty darn unethical. Yeah, and but the point is, again, it's not unilateral. All right, and if you have the wrong analysis, you're gonna have the wrong fix. There is great danger in these Marxist ideas of one group being inherently evil or inherently inferior in some way, and then another group is superior in another group. All right, if it's not hard to find in human history that every group has its fair share of good and bad, and it is dangerous when the tribalism and sectarianism gets extreme. We see that in we see that in Sunnis versus Shiites, same ethnos, sectarianism, tribalism, and in terms of like this whiteness backlash, you all need to be very careful of this because there are already many cautionary tales. Look at the history of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, after it got its independence from Rhodesia, they wanted to erase the whiteness. And what did they do? Well, they wanted not an equal society. They wanted a revenge. And by taking revenge, they essentially destroyed their own agriculture. So Rhodesia was one of the biggest agricultural centers of Africa. And then Zimbabwe, took over. They rebelled and took over. They basically said if we want to get rid of all whiteness, that means white farms, we want to even get rid of white shoes, anything that reminded of whiteness, they want to get rid of, and destroy the country. Zimbabwe has been in dire circumstances for decades now. Their currency is absolutely worthless. Like $1 trillion Zimbabwe dollars is nothing. It's a few dollars at most, I think. Um, all the wrong policies. All the wrong policies. So be careful what you wish for, right? As a martial artist that subscribes to Bruce Lee's teachings, we just we take what's useful. We don't judge people by their just inherent demographics, something that they're born with or they can't change. We don't judge. We integrate and assimilate into a larger society which takes the best out of everybody and tries to remove the worst and try not to bring in the bad. All right, and then you got yourself a very clean, efficient system. Now I'm gonna leave off with colorism for myself, and that is, well, I'm an Asian American male. Obviously, I grew up in the '80s and '90s. I grew up in the height of anti-Asian American male, and I grew up in an area of very high anti-Asian American male because see in my area, you know, it was it was already very left leaning, and I had many school teachers who discriminated against boys. I remember one of the teachers, she said that, boys should never touch girls because that's sexual harassment. And this is like, this is like the early 90s. And I was pretty traumatized by that. Like I wouldn't shake girls' hands, I wouldn't hug them. Very just aloof, like, stay, like I can't even get near you, right? Because that'd be sexual harassment. And that persisted for a long time because that was the culture really reinforced that around the area. And then you add to that the crazy amounts of Asian American male emasculation. There was always some emasculating stereotypical joke going on in Hollywood and the movies. And there was a very large diaspora between Asian American females and males, where females were put on a pedestal. You had big movie stars like Lucy Liu. You had popular news anchors like Lisa Ling. The list goes on. And then anytime an Asian male was in media, they're portrayed as either a stern Japanese dad or a nerd or, small dick jokes. Small dick jokes left and right, okay? Couldn't escape it. Every day. Every day I went out. Every day I went out and out. Someone would always say something. Go to a bar. Strike up a conversation. That'd be the first thing they say. For years. So, I know what that's like, okay? My generation, we know what it's like. And let me tell you how it got better. It started to get better in my late 20s, and it basically correlated with the rise of the Chinese economy. And because Western nations are capitalistic, especially America, in their hierarchy, they value, or they see somebody as wealthy as both attractive and powerful. Neither of which, so that's the opposite, those are the opposite qualities of someone who's emasculated. Not too long after, American firms had to start, especially retail, started to cater their ads towards the Chinese market because they had money. And for the first time, I think ever, I saw an Asian American male in a fashion ad and a Calvin Klein ad, and I was like, wow, this is groundbreaking. And then then I finally saw one in Abercrombie and Fitch, which is like the most rustic American, and it is basically done at that point. The ads kept rolling in, and it was a feedback cycle. So that is how we pretty much, we're not quite out of it yet. There's still a lot of data to support. There's still a lot of disparities, but the gaps have closed a lot. If you look at OkCupid data, for example, and that's just online dating. But if you look at that, the disparities between Asian male attractiveness versus all the other males like black, Hispanic, white, it's been closing over years. We've been bottom barrel for decades, and we still are. But I think the disparities in message responses from women have gone from like 15 to 1 to, like the disparity of, I don't know what it is now, maybe 6 to 1 or something like that. But that's how you do it. You can't, leftists want to force change, right? They want, especially government, to get involved. They want higher powers, authorities to tell people how to think, and they will choose one area where they want it, for like college admissions or whatnot, but not another area like dating prospects. And when you put it in that light, it actually does seem really absurd, doesn't it? If the government took everybody and said, we're going to have egalitarian equity dating, and 10% of whites now must date Asians, 10% of blacks must date Asian males. That's obviously just super intrusive into someone's life, right? But certainly from that example, you can start to understand, where do we draw the line? Because there is a line. And do you trust the government to do this for you? Do you trust the government to find your mate for you? I mean, that's the most hyperbolic example, but also something of big impact, because in the human experience, finding your mate and dating, that's one of the biggest things most humans go through. And my demographic was essentially excluded from that for a very long time. in this locale. Notice how I'm keeping my scope within this locale. I've been into other countries too. Obviously, Asian males in Asia do much better in Asia. Even in Europe, they do better. I've dated in Europe, and for the most part, Western and Northern European women are much more, were comparatively so at that time, were much more receptive than American. So, how do you address colorism? Well, you don't try to force people's mind. You rise and ascend above it, and that's what my demographic has had to do. We just have to demonstrate that we are deserving. You can't demand and just say we are deserving. You show it, okay? You prove yourself. All right. In China's case, because a lot of people think of China as most of Asia, the perception of Chinese applies to more than just Chinese. That's how we got out of it. So that's my answer to you, BLM and colorism. I hope you watched all that, and I am open to talking to more. I have so much more on BLM, so much more.